the Cross and the Crescent. In the year 1187, under the scorching sun of northern Palestine, a conflict was about to erupt that would change the course of history. It would bring empires to their knees, restore a city revered by millions, and etch the name of Salahuddin Ayyubi into the hearts of generations. The stage was the arid expanse near the Sea of Galilee, a dry, dusty region where two worlds would clash in the name of God, land, and destiny. For nearly a century, Crusader kingdoms had ruled parts of the Holy Land. Born of blood during the First Crusade in 1099, these kingdoms had installed Latin Christian rulers in cities once governed by Muslim dynasties. Jerusalem, the third holiest city in Islam, had been seized and transformed into a fortress of Christendom. The Islamic world was shocked, fragmented, and initially powerless to respond. But slowly, the tide began to turn. Out of the political and religious turmoil of the Muslim world, a unifier arose, Salahuddin ibn Ayyub. A man of Kurdish origin, trained in the courts of Damascus and the battlefields of Egypt, Salahuddin was more than just a warrior. He was a statesman, a scholar, and a symbol of righteous struggle. His vision was to reunite the Islamic world under one banner and reclaim Jerusalem, not just through force, but with faith, wisdom, and perseverance. By the mid-1180s, Salahuddin had achieved the impossible. He had brought Egypt and Syria under his command, healed sectarian divides, and assembled the largest Muslim army the region had seen in generations. To his enemies, he was a formidable threat. To his people, he was a beacon of unity and justice. His opponents, the Crusaders, were no less determined. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, ruled by the French-born King Guy of Lusignan, stood as the centerpiece of Crusader power. Supported by a network of castles, knights, and European reinforcements, the Latin Christians believed they could hold their sacred city forever. Yet deep divisions plagued them. The Crusader nobility was fractured by jealousy, greed, and pride. Among them stood the infamous Reynald de Chatillon, a rogue lord who defied truces and raided Muslim caravans, even those en route to Mecca. His cruelty would soon bring divine retribution. Tensions between the Muslim and Christian worlds had reached a boiling point. The air was thick with prophecy and dread. Pilgrims prayed for peace, while warriors prepared for war. All paths now led to one fateful place, a forgotten hill near a dry, windswept plain known as the Horns of Hattin. What followed was not just a battle. It was a reckoning, an event so monumental that it would echo through centuries. In the words of chroniclers, it was the day the kingdom of the cross was humbled and the lion of Islam roared. This is the story of the Battle of Hattin, told in full, in fury, and in faith. The road to war. To understand the thunder of swords that would echo across the plains of Hattin, we must trace the winding road that led there, a road paved with blood, betrayal, and ambition. A fractured land. In the early 12th century, the Crusaders had carved out 4 Latin Christian states in the heart of the Muslim world. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the now-fallen County of Edessa. These Crusader states were foreign outposts, fueled by religious zeal and reinforced by knights from Europe. Yet behind their stone walls, these kingdoms were fragile, surrounded by Muslim powers, plagued by internal rivalries, and reliant on reinforcements from across the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, the Muslim world was equally fractured. Seljuk Turks, Arab emirs, and rival dynasties vied for dominance. Sunni and Shia divisions weakened unity. For decades after the fall of Jerusalem in 1099, no single Muslim power had the strength or the vision to push the Crusaders back. That would change with the rise of a man named Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. The rise of Salahuddin Ayyubi. Salahuddin was born in 1137 in Tikrit, in modern-day Iraq. He was not a prince or a caliph, but the son of a respected Kurdish officer serving under Nur ad-Din Zengi, the ruler of Aleppo and Damascus. As a young man, Salahuddin joined his uncle Shirkuh on military campaigns into Egypt, where the Shia Fatimid Caliphate was crumbling. In 1169, after Shirkuh's death, Salahuddin unexpectedly became the vizier of Egypt. In 2 years, he abolished the Fatimid Caliphate and restored Sunni rule, pledging loyalty to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. With Egypt secure, he began to build a new power base, not for personal gain, but for a grander cause. He envisioned a unified Islamic front, a realm where Egypt and Syria, Arabs and Kurds, Sunnis and even respectful Shia, could all fight together under one banner against the Crusaders. But uniting the Muslim world was not a simple task. War and diplomacy. Between 1174 and 1186, Salahuddin carried out a breathtaking campaign of political diplomacy, strategic marriages, military conquest, and religious outreach. He captured Damascus, then Aleppo, and finally Mosul, dealing carefully with jealous emirs and potential rivals. He never claimed the caliphate. Instead, he ruled in the name of Islam, and that gave him legitimacy. By the late 1180s, he was the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, leading the most powerful Muslim army since the days of the early caliphs. But what truly set Salahuddin apart wasn't just his strength, it was his vision of jihad. Unlike earlier rulers who used religion for power, Salahuddin believed sincerely that liberating Jerusalem was a religious duty. His sermons, letters, and speeches all echoed with purpose. He wept in prayer, fasted before campaigns, and studied the Quran. To his soldiers, he was not just a commander, he was a mujahid, a warrior of faith. The provocation. Reynald of Chatillon. While Salahuddin was uniting Muslim lands, the Crusader states were tearing themselves apart from within. At the center of the chaos stood Reynald of Chatillon, a brutal and reckless noble who ruled the fortress of Kerak, deep in the territory of Al-Trajordan. Reynald had no respect for truces, treaties, or sacred boundaries. In the 1180s, he raided Muslim caravans, including Hajj pilgrims bound for Mecca, violating every known code of war. In 1186, he launched his boldest insult yet. He attacked a royal Muslim caravan, capturing its guards and taking Salahuddin's sister prisoner. This was no ordinary crime, it was a declaration of war. Salahuddin, known for his patience and diplomacy, swore by the Quran, "I will not rest until I have washed my sword in the blood of that treacherous dog Reynald." He began assembling a coalition the likes of which the Crusaders had never seen, armies from Egypt, Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul, and the Hejaz. Thousands of infantry, cavalry, and archers rallied to his banner. His warriors wore white, the color of purity. Their cause, to purify Jerusalem of Crusader rule. The fracture in Jerusalem. At this critical moment, the kingdom of Jerusalem found itself in peril. Its new king, Guy of Lusignan, had ascended the throne through marriage. Lacking the charisma or experience of his predecessors, he was resented by other nobles, especially the powerful Raymond III of Tripoli, who had ruled Jerusalem as regent for years. Raymond believed that a full-scale war with Salahuddin would destroy the kingdom. He advocated negotiation and cautious defense. But men like Reynald, and the Grand Masters of the Templars and Hospitallers, wanted war. They believed in divine protection, even as they ignored the harsh political reality. Against Raymond's advice, King Guy placed his trust in Reynald and the hardliners. It was the final mistake that would doom the Crusader kingdom. The march begins. In late June 1187, Salahuddin made his move. He crossed the Jordan River with over 30,000 troops and laid siege to the Crusader fortress of Tiberius, a strategic city near the Sea of Galilee. Inside the citadel was Countess Esquiva, the wife of Raymond of Tripoli. Salahuddin knew this would bait the Crusaders into a trap. And it worked. A council of war was held at Saphuria, where the Crusader army, nearly 20,000 strong, was gathered. Raymond pleaded with King Guy to stay put and force Salahuddin to come to them. Saphuria had water, walls, and a strong defensive position. But Reynald, the Templars, and others called him a coward. Pride won. King Guy gave the fatal command. We marched to Tiberius. On July 2nd, the Crusader army set out eastward under the blazing sun, carrying banners, supplies, and their holiest relic, the true cross. They had no idea they were walking straight into the jaws of death. The Crusader mistake and the eve of battle. The decision to march toward Tiberius would mark the beginning of the end for the Crusader kingdom. It was not simply a military error, it was the fatal triumph of pride over prudence, of recklessness over reason. As the Crusader army left the fortified springs of Saphuria on July 2, 1187, they stepped away from their only reliable water source in the region. The midday sun was already brutal. The long columns of infantry, knights, and baggage trains stretched out across the parched land, dragging themselves toward Tiberius. They believed they could reach the city and lift the siege within a day. But Salahuddin had no intention of letting them arrive. His scouts monitored every Crusader movement. His cavalry and light horse archers darted in and out of range, harassing the flanks and rear. Dust rose in thick clouds, blinding the advancing army. Without access to wells or streams, dehydration set in quickly. Men collapsed under the weight of their armor. Horses died in droves. By evening, the Crusaders had barely covered 6 miles. The column halted for the night near a rocky hill called Masara, just west of the Horns of Hattin. Desperation gripped the camp. Fires lit to cook rations were soon extinguished. There was nothing left to burn, and no water to be spared. Men drank their own urine, gnawed on dry leather. The morale of even the hardened Templars was crumbling. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, Salahuddin's army remained fresh and alert. They had access to water and supplies from nearby villages. Archers patrolled the hills, keeping the enemy awake with arrows and torches. That night, the Muslim soldiers surrounded the Crusader camp with flaming bundles of dry grass. The wind, blowing eastward, carried choking smoke into the Christian ranks. What had begun as a march of deliverance had become a death march. As dawn broke on July 4, 1187, the Crusaders found themselves completely encircled. The battle begins. The morning of July 4, 1187, dawned under a veil of smoke, sweat, and dread. The Crusader army awoke to the reality of a full encirclement by the Muslim forces of Salahuddin Ayyubi. The Horns of Hattin, a pair of twin hills rising out of the Galilean plain, now stood not as a beacon of salvation but as a trap from which there would be no escape. The Crusaders, already weakened from thirst and sleeplessness, attempted to form ranks. The air was heavy, not just with the smoke of burning brush but with the weight of divine judgment. The Muslims began the assault at first light. Thousands of horse archers surged forward, riding in waves across the dry earth, loosing arrows in rhythmic unison. The Frankish infantry, in tightly packed formations, raised their shields and braced their lances. The knights, elite warriors in heavy armor, tried to hold the line, but Salahuddin's strategy was brilliantly executed. He ordered feigned retreats, a tactic well known among the Turks and Kurds, which lured isolated Crusader units away from the main force and left them vulnerable to ambushes. Meanwhile, the core of the Crusader army, centered around the sacred relic of the true cross, was pinned on the lower slopes of the Horns. Bishops carried the relic aloft, hoping its divine power would inspire the troops. Yet there was no miracle to be found. The sun blazed high, and the cries of the wounded filled the valley. Desperate for water, King Guy of Lusignan ordered a breakout charge toward the Sea of Galilee to the east. Knights of the Templar and Hospitaller orders thundered across the battlefield, lowering lances and roaring battle hymns. For a moment, it seemed the line might hold. But Salahuddin was ready. He unleashed his elite Mamluk cavalry, who countered the charge with precision. Encircled, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered, the Crusader cavalry was decimated. Those who fled were cut down. Those who remained were taken captive. The Crusader infantry, witnessing the destruction of their leaders and cavalry, began to disintegrate. Entire battalions dropped their weapons and begged for mercy. Others fled up the horns, hoping to use the elevation as a last stand. It was here, on the summit, that the final resistance was crushed. Muslim infantry climbed the slopes from all sides. The Crusaders, too exhausted to fight, were overwhelmed. Salahuddin, observing from a nearby rise, gave the order to show mercy to those who surrendered, except for the members of the militant orders. The Templars and Hospitallers, seen as fanatical warriors who would never compromise, were executed. Chroniclers say that over 200 knights were beheaded that afternoon. It was not an act of cruelty but one of military necessity. Salahuddin could not risk such men returning to the field. Among the captives were King Guy himself and his most hated companion, Reynald of Chatillon. Salahuddin invited the two into his tent. According to eyewitnesses, the Sultan handed a cup of water to King Guy, a symbol of clemency in Islamic culture. But when Guy passed the cup to Reynald, Salahuddin turned cold. He told Reynald he had broken every law of honor, faith, and decency. Then Salahuddin stood, drew his sword, and personally struck down Reynald. He would later say, "It is not for kings to kill kings." But that man was no king. He was a traitor to God. King Guy, shaken, was spared and later ransomed. As the sun set over Hattin, the battlefield lay silent. Thousands of Crusaders lay dead or in chains. The true cross was captured and paraded through the Muslim camp. The armies of Islam had won not just a battle, but a turning point in the Holy War. And Salahuddin had done it not through brute strength, but through patience, strategy, and faith. The aftermath: mercy and justice. The Battle of Hattin was over, but its consequences were only just beginning. As the dust settled on the arid plain, Salahuddin's soldiers moved through the wreckage. The once proud Crusader army lay shattered, its banners trampled, its knights either dead, imprisoned, or broken in spirit. Muslim forces gathered the prisoners and sorted them based on rank and status. High-ranking nobles, knights, and military leaders were identified for ransom, a common practice in medieval warfare. Salahuddin's commanders ensured that the defeated were not mistreated, in accordance with Islamic laws of war and chivalry. The Sultan's reputation for justice was not simply an image, it was a principle deeply embedded in his worldview. When the true cross was discovered among the wreckage, it was treated not as a religious prize to be desecrated, but as a symbolic trophy. It was paraded through Muslim cities to showcase the magnitude of the victory. The psychological blow to Christendom was immense. For the Crusaders, the loss of the true cross was more than material, it was spiritual defeat. Judgment in the Sultan's tent. As for the most significant prisoners, Salahuddin's decisions would become legendary. King Guy of Lusignan, trembling and humiliated, was brought before Salahuddin under heavy guard. The Sultan received him with courtesy. Islamic custom held that once a man drank from your cup, his life was sacred. When Guy was handed a cup of water, he took a sip, then passed it to Reynald of Chatillon. Salahuddin, interpreting this act as an attempt to extend clemency to Reynald, responded sharply, "It was you I gave the water, not him." He turned to Reynald and accused him of his crimes: the broken truces, the attacks on pilgrims, and his threats against the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Reynald, proud and defiant to the end, refused to show remorse. Salahuddin, with no hesitation, drew his scimitar and struck Reynald down. The execution was not an act of vengeance, but of justice in Salahuddin's eyes. To allow Reynald to live would be to condone his crimes against the innocent. To many in the Muslim world, the death of Reynald was seen as divine justice. Guy, by contrast, was spared. Salahuddin would later say, "A king does not kill a king." The fate of the captives. What followed next was both merciful and pragmatic. The majority of the common soldiers, those not part of the military orders, were kept alive. Some were sold into slavery, others were imprisoned and later released in exchange for Muslim captives. But the Templars and Hospitallers, warrior monks who had taken vows to fight to the death, were treated differently. Salahuddin ordered the execution of approximately 230 of these men. The decision was made not out of cruelty, but from a strategic standpoint. These were not just soldiers, they were ideologically driven fighters who, if released, would return to the battlefield. The executions were carried out in the presence of Salahuddin's scholars and commanders, and many chroniclers noted that the Sultan turned away during the act, unwilling to witness it personally. The collapse of the Crusader kingdom. What followed the Battle of Hattin was nothing short of a political and military collapse for the Crusader states. Salahuddin moved swiftly and with methodical precision. The Crusaders had lost their army, their leaders, and their morale. In just weeks following the battle, the Sultan's forces swept through the Levant. City after city, Acre, Nablus, Sidon, Jaffa, Beirut, and Ascalon, fell without significant resistance. Even powerful fortresses, long considered impenetrable, were abandoned or surrendered by panicked defenders. Only a few strongholds, such as Tyre, held out, due largely to the leadership of newly arrived nobles like Conrad of Montferrat. Then came Salahuddin's ultimate prize, Jerusalem. On September 20, 1187, he laid siege to the Holy City. Unlike the brutal sack of the city by the Crusaders in 1099, Salahuddin's approach was humane. He offered generous terms. Any Christian who could pay a ransom would be allowed to leave with dignity. For those who couldn't, Salahuddin allowed many to go free. Women, children, and the poor were treated with compassion. The gates of Jerusalem were opened on October 2, 1187, which coincided with 27th Rajab, the Islamic date traditionally associated with the Isra and Miraj, the Prophet Muhammad's night journey. The symbolism was unmistakable. Islam had reclaimed one of its holiest sites. Mosques were cleansed and reopened. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa were purified with rose water. The Christian churches were respected and not desecrated. Salahuddin ordered no retaliation for the massacres of 1099. His conduct stunned even his enemies. The contrast between the capture of Jerusalem in 1099 and its liberation in 1187 could not have been clearer. Echoes through history. Legacy of Hattin. The Battle of Hattin was not just a military triumph. It was a turning point in the Crusades and a moment that reshaped the identity of the medieval world. For Muslims, it was a day of redemption. Salahuddin had succeeded in uniting a fragmented ummah and restoring dignity to a people who had endured a century of humiliation. His chivalry, humility, and vision earned him not only the respect of his allies, but also the admiration of his enemies. For Christians, Hattin was a devastating shock. The news of the defeat and the loss of Jerusalem shook Europe to its core. It prompted the launch of the Third Crusade, led by kings like Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa. Though Jerusalem would not be recaptured by the Crusaders, the Third Crusade would lead to a legendary encounter between Salahuddin and Richard. Their mutual respect and honorable conduct became the stuff of legends, two warriors on opposite sides of faith, bound by the same code of honor. Salahuddin passed away in 1193, not in a golden palace, but in a modest home. He left behind little wealth, having given most of his fortune to the poor. At his funeral, his advisers displayed an empty purse, declaring, "This is all that remains of the conqueror of kingdoms." The Battle of Hattin lives on in Islamic memory as a symbol of justice, unity, and the power of faith. In Western history, it remains a sobering reminder of overconfidence and disunity. In both, it stands as a lesson that leadership grounded in principle can move mountains. And so, on that scorched hilltop near the Sea of Galilee, history was rewritten, not just with a sword, but with the soul of a man who believed in something greater than conquest. This was Hattin. This was Salahuddin.